The gun was already in her hand when Emmett Conroy grabbed her wrist, not to stop her from shooting. He grabbed her wrist because his eldest son Caleb, 16 years old and full of hot fury, had nearly stepped into the line of fire, and Delia Langston had pivoted so fast and so precisely that Emmett's heart seized in his chest before his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. She had not flinched. She had not gasped. She had simply moved, repositioned, and stood with the Colt .45 now, aimed directly at the rattlesnake coiled at the base of the fence post not 8 feet from where young Caleb stood frozen, his boot heel inches from a second strike. There were 2 of them. Emmett had only seen one. Delia had seen both. The shot rang out across the yard so clean and so certain that the birds in the cottonwood tree did not even scatter. One rattled her down. She stepped 3 paces left without looking away from the ground, found the second one trying to slide beneath the trough and put a bullet through its head before Emmett had fully registered she was moving. 2 shots, 2 dead snakes, 8 seconds from start to finish. Caleb exhaled. His knees buckled slightly. His younger brothers, 10-year-old Nate and 8-year-old Poe, stood at the porch rail with their mouths hanging open like baby birds waiting for feeding. Emmett still held Delia's wrist. He became aware of this fact very slowly, the way a man becomes aware he has walked into deep water before he remembers he cannot swim. He let go. He looked at her. She holstered the pistol with a motion so practiced it was almost ceremonial, and then she looked back at him with those storm-gray eyes that had been making him uncomfortable since the morning she arrived, and she said, very quietly, "You were going to say something about whether a woman ought to be carrying a firearm on the property." He had absolutely been about to say exactly that. He closed his mouth. She turned back toward the schoolroom she had been setting up in his barn, lifted the crate of primers and chalk she had set down when the snakes appeared, and walked away without another word, her dark braids swaying between her shoulder blades like a pendulum counting out the seconds of his silence. That was the moment, though Emmett Conroy would not admit it for another 6 weeks, when everything in him shifted. Something old and locked moved in his chest, something he had nailed shut 3 years ago when he buried his wife Clara in the red earth behind the property line, and he stood in the afternoon sun of the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1882, watching a schoolteacher walk away from him, and he thought, with a kind of terrible clarity, that he was in serious trouble. He had needed someone to teach his boys. That was all. That was supposed to be all. He had written to the placement bureau in Amarillo in March of that year, not long after the winter thaw revealed just how badly his sons had fallen behind. Caleb could read barely, and he could do figures in his head when he wanted to, but Emmett had found him copying cattle ledger entries backwards in February, mixing up his letters, and getting so angry about it that he had put a fist through the barn wall. Nate, the middle boy, was brilliant in ways that frightened Emmett because he recognized in his son a mind that was going to either build something magnificent or burn something magnificent down, and without proper direction, Emmett was not sure which direction it would go. And Poe, the youngest, named for a poet his late wife Clara had loved, could not read a single word. He was 8 years old and he could not read a single word, and when the other children at the small community church had laughed at him for it the previous autumn, Poe had come home and not spoken for 4 days. That silence had broken Emmett in a way that losing cattle and facing drought and burying his wife had not quite managed to accomplish. So he had written to the bureau. He had paid the fee. He had explained the situation plainly and without sentiment, because Emmett Conroy was not a man who leaned on sentiment. He had 3 sons, ages 16, 10, and 8. He lived 30 miles outside of Amarillo on a working cattle ranch called the Conroy Double C. He needed an educator who could manage children without coddling them into weakness. He needed someone who could be firm. He needed someone who would stay. That last line he had written 3 times and crossed out twice before finally leaving it in. He needed someone who would stay. The bureau sent him Delia Langston, and Delia Langston was not what he expected. which was, as it turned out, the understatement of the decade. She had arrived on the stage from Amarillo on a Tuesday morning in late June, and Emmett had driven the wagon into town to collect her. He had expected a soft, city-bred woman in her middle years who smelled of lavender and had opinions about proper dining etiquette. What stepped off the stage instead was a woman of perhaps 28 years, slender but not fragile, with dark hair braided practically over one shoulder, wearing a plain dove-gray dress that was sensible rather than fashionable, and carrying a leather satchel that was so heavily loaded with books that it left a mark on the ground when she set it down. She wore boots, not delicate shoes, boots. She had a belt, and on that belt there was a holster, and in that holster there was a revolver that was not decorative. Emmett had stared at it. "Delia Langston," she had said, extending her hand to shake his like a business partner. Not a curtsy, a handshake. "I understand you need an educator." "Emmett Conroy," he had replied, shaking her hand and trying to rearrange his face into something that didn't convey the degree of his surprise. "I do." "Good," she had said, and picked up her satchel like it weighed nothing. "Then let us not waste either of our time. Lead on." He had loaded her trunk and her satchel, and she had climbed up onto the wagon seat without waiting for him to assist her, and he had stood there for a moment, looking at the empty air where he'd intended to offer his hand, and then he'd climbed up on his side and pointed the horses toward home. They rode 30 miles in a conversation that was not conversation. It was interrogation, conducted with perfect courtesy by Delia Langston, who asked him methodical questions about his son's individual learning gaps, their temperaments, their history with education, and their relationship with one another. She had a small notebook, and she wrote in it with quick, precise strokes, not decorative penmanship but functional, fast, readable script that she never once had to look down to produce. She watched the road and the land and him, while her hand moved across the page, and Emmett found himself answering her questions fully and honestly, which was unusual for him, because he was not a man who explained himself freely. By the time they reached the ranch, he had told her things about Caleb's reading difficulties that he had not told anyone, including the pastor's wife who had tried to help the previous winter. He had told her about Nate's habit of arguing every point until whoever was arguing with him simply gave up, and how Emmett was not sure whether to be proud or concerned. He had told her about Poe's silence after the church incident, and about the 4 days without speaking, and about the way the boy had taken to carrying a small battered copy of Edgar Allan Poe's collected poems, because he liked the pictures of the letters even though he couldn't read them, and that his mother had read him Poe aloud, and that was where his name came from, and Emmett had not meant to say that last part and had stopped talking abruptly. Delia had said, "Clara sounds like she was a remarkable woman." He had not told her his wife's name. He had not mentioned his wife at all. He'd looked at her sharply. She had been looking at the horizon. "You wrote that your wife passed 3 years ago in your inquiry letter to the Bureau," she said, not unkindly. "I read everything carefully. Poe would have been 5 when she died. That is a significant age to lose a parent. The poetry connection makes complete sense." He had said nothing. After a moment he had said, "You read carefully." "Always," she had said. "It is the only way to read." The ranch appeared on the horizon then, the low-slung house and the big barn and the cottonwood trees along the creek, and Emmett had felt something he could not name, something that was almost relief, which was strange because he had not expected to feel anything from this arrangement at all except practical solution to a practical problem. Caleb met them in the yard with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in the expression that most closely resembled Emmett's own face when he was being difficult, which the boy had inherited along with his father's height and his tendency toward stubbornness. He was taller at 16 than many grown men in the county, broad in the shoulder, with Clara's chestnut hair and Emmett's dark eyes. "She don't look like a schoolteacher," Caleb had said, in a voice that was trying to sound careless and landing somewhere closer to suspicious. "She does not," Delia had replied agreeably, stepping down from the wagon. and you do not look like a young man who is struggling with reading reversals. Yet here we both are. I am Delia Langston. You may call me Miss Langston, or you may call me Delia. Either is acceptable. What is not acceptable is calling me anything that implies I am temporary, because I intend to be here for the full contracted term of 1 year, and likely longer if your father and I reach an agreement about extension. Where are your brothers? Caleb had stared at her. The muscles in his jaw had relaxed, not much, but enough. Nate had appeared in the barn doorway at precisely that moment, curious as a cat, and Poe had materialized behind Caleb's left elbow like a small pale ghost, clutching his book of poems to his chest and watching Delia with enormous dark eyes. Delia had crouched down to Poe's level immediately, which put her on the ground in the dust in her good dress without hesitation, and she had said, "Is that Edgar Allan Poe?" Poe had nodded once very slowly. "Which poem is your favorite?" she had asked. Poe had opened the book and pointed to a page, not the title, the page, because he couldn't read the title. Delia had looked at the page and said, without missing a beat, "Annabel Lee. Excellent taste. It is one of mine as well. Would you like me to read it to you tonight after supper?" Poe had looked at her for a long time. Then he had put his small hand in hers. And Emmett, watching this from 3 feet away, had felt something loosen in his chest like a fist unclenching, and had looked away at the mountains because he did not want whatever was on his face to be visible. That had been 3 weeks ago. The snake incident was 3 weeks later, and it marked the end of the beginning, though Emmett did not know how to name it yet. What had happened in those 3 weeks was this. Delia Langston had transformed the back section of the barn into a schoolroom with a blackboard she had made from a sheet of slate she had somehow procured from the general store in town, 2 benches, a work table, and a system of pegged boards for posting the boys' work that she called a learning wall. She had assessed each boy individually and methodically. She had discovered that Caleb had what she called a reading inversion, meaning his eyes transposed certain letters and numbers, and it was not a failure of intellect, but a specific condition she had read about in a medical journal out of the university in Austin. She had developed a system of exercises for him using textured letters he could trace with his fingers, marrying the tactile sense to the visual, and within 2 weeks Caleb was reading sentences that had previously defeated him, and the look on his face when he realized it was working was a thing that made grown men want to clear their throats and find somewhere else to be. With Nate, she had done something entirely different. She had stopped trying to make him be quiet and instead had turned his arguing into the curriculum itself. She gave him positions to defend, problems with multiple valid answers, historical debates to research and argue from different sides. She taught him formal logical structure for argument, and then made him argue against his own positions, which enraged him magnificently and made him think harder than he ever had in his life. Within 10 days Nate was reading 3 books at once and making Emmett discuss the merits of the Homestead Act at the dinner table. And while Emmett was not entirely sure how to feel about that, he could not deny the boy was alight with something. With Poe she had started not with letters at all, but with the poems Poe already loved. She had read them aloud every evening as promised, sitting in the lamplight on the porch with Poe curled against her side, his small finger following the lines of text while she read, connecting the sound to the symbol, over and over, with infinite patience and 0 pressure. She had learned from Emmett that Poe had suffered badly at the hands of a prior schoolmaster who used shame as a teaching tool, and she had methodically and completely dismantled every association Poe had between learning and humiliation. By the end of the 2nd week, Poe could identify every letter of the alphabet. By the end of the 3rd, he could sound out simple words. The morning after the snake incident, he had read aloud the first line of Annabel Lee by himself, stumbling only twice, and Delia had said, "There it is," with such quiet satisfaction that Poe had burst into tears and hidden his face in her shoulder, and she had held him without making a single fuss about it. Emmett had seen this from the barn doorway. He had been supposed to be checking the hay storage. He had stood in the doorway for a very long time. The trouble was not just that she was excellent at her job, though she was. The trouble was not just that his sons were flourishing in ways they had not flourished since before Clara died, though that was true as well. The trouble was that Delia Langston was also quietly, thoroughly, and with complete competence handling the frontier life of the ranch in ways that no one had asked her to, and that she clearly did not need anyone's approval to attempt. She had assessed the water quality of the creek on her second day, and told him with specificity that the upper bend was fine, but the lower pool near the old fence post was showing signs of contamination from the decomposed Osage orange wood, and that his cattle should not drink from it after August when the water dropped. He had stared at her. She had explained that her father had been a surveyor and a naturalist in New Mexico territory, and that she had spent much of her childhood reading his field journals and following him across some of the most difficult terrain in the Southwest, and that water quality was a subject she had studied formally as well as practically. She had looked at the sky one evening with an expression of quiet focus and told him a storm was coming from the northwest within 48 hours, a significant one, and that the west-facing boards on the barn needed to be checked for gaps before it arrived. He had checked the boards because he did not know how not to after the water conversation, and he had found 3 loose boards, and the storm had arrived 42 hours later and would have done real damage if the boards hadn't been secured. She could track. He had discovered this by accident when Nate's dog had gone missing one morning, and before Emmett had properly organized a search. Delia had followed the dog's prints through the mud near the creek and found him trapped in a hollow log not half a mile south, frightened but unharmed. She had tracked barefoot through the creek shallows because the dog's prints had crossed it, and she had come back with mud on her feet and the dog under her arm, and Nate had thrown himself at her with such relief that she had nearly fallen over, and she had laughed, which was a sound Emmett had not yet heard from her, clear and unguarded and brief, and it had done something to the air that he could not account for. And then there was the shooting, which he had known about in theory because she was wearing the pistol. But knowing and witnessing were very different things. The precision of her was remarkable. The calm of her was remarkable. The way she had taken in both snakes where he had seen only one, the way she had placed herself between the threat and Caleb without making a performance of it, the way she had moved as though she had done this particular thing exactly before, which of course she probably had. The frontier was the frontier, and a woman alone in it needed to be capable of defending herself. He understood all of this. He understood it in his head. His heart was doing something entirely separate from his head, which was the problem. 2 days after the snake incident, Emmett rode out to the south pasture to check the fence line and found Delia already there, sitting on the fence rail, writing in her notebook with the morning sun coming sideways across the land and turning everything the color of copper and gold. She was not watching the sunrise. She was making notes. He could see from 20 yards that her pen was moving, but she was also watching the pasture with that peripheral awareness she seemed to carry constantly, which was itself a frontier skill, the ability to be fully occupied and fully present at the same time. He pulled his horse up beside the fence. "You're up early," he said. "I am always up early," she said without looking up from the notebook. "I mapped your property boundaries this morning. The southeast corner marker is off by approximately 30 yards. If you are ever in a legal dispute over that line, you should know. I can draw you a corrected survey if you like." He looked at her. "You surveyed my property." "Walked it, yes. I needed the morning air and I had the instruments." She patted the satchel at her feet. It clinked faintly. Surveying instruments. She had surveying instruments in her satchel. "Your father-in-law's original claim may have included an error in the northeast boundary as well. I would need another morning to confirm it, but the angle of the creek bend suggests it." Emmett sat on his horse for a moment, looking at the woman sitting on his fence rail in the early morning light, and thought several things simultaneously. He thought that she was the most genuinely useful person who had ever set foot on his property. He thought that she made him feel, in some complicated and not entirely comfortable way, as though everything that had been askew in his world for the past 3 years was being quietly, methodically, put back into some kind of alignment. He thought that her profile in the morning light was something that a man could look at for a very long time without becoming tired of it, and that he should not be thinking that, and he was going to stop thinking it immediately. "Thank you," he said. She looked up then. The gray eyes met his and something passed between them that was not yet anything you could name, a kind of mutual acknowledgement that they were both aware of something that neither of them was going to address, because the time was not right, and perhaps they were both afraid, and perhaps that was the most honest thing either of them was willing to admit in that moment. Then she looked back at her notebook. "Of course," she said, "it is your land. You should know its exact dimensions." He rode the fence line and she walked it alongside him, which he had not asked her to do but which she simply did, and they talked about the ranch in a way that was different from the interrogation of the first day. It was more like two people who were both responsible for the same thing speaking honestly about what they each knew. She had observations about the pasture quality and which sections were overgrazed. He had information about which sections had been rested and for how long. She had read about a grass management approach being used in Colorado that divided pastures into rotation sections, and she described it clearly and he listened. And by the time they had walked the full south fence line, they had arrived at a plan for the summer grazing rotation that made better sense than what he had been doing, which he acknowledged, because Emmett Conroy was a stubborn man, but he was not a stupid one. On the way back, she stepped in a prairie dog hole and stumbled, and his hand shot out and caught her elbow, and she caught his forearm to steady herself. And for about 3 seconds they were standing in the middle of the pasture, holding onto each other with the kind of accidental closeness that lands in the chest differently than intended contact ever could. She released his arm first and said thank you and kept walking, and he kept walking, and neither of them said anything for the rest of the way back. But something had changed in the quality of the silence between them, and they both knew it. That evening after supper, which Delia ate with the family at Emmett's invitation because the alternative was eating alone at the small table in the room he'd cleared for her in the house, and she was too practical to refuse a sensible offer even if she was entirely capable of fending for herself, Caleb asked her a question that stopped the table. "How come you know so many things?" he said, not rudely, with genuine puzzlement. "My teacher in town only knew books. You know books and also everything else." Delia had considered this with the same seriousness she gave every question, and she said, "My mother died when I was 6. My father chose to keep me with him rather than send me to relatives, so I traveled with him across the territory for 10 years while he worked. I learned what was necessary to survive and to understand the land I was moving through. When I was 16, I went east to attend normal school, which is a school for teachers in Missouri. I spent 3 years there learning formal education methods. Then I came back west because the east does not suit me." "Why not?" Nate asked, his fork suspended in midair. "Because there is too much pretending," she said simply. "People pretend things matter that do not and pretend things do not matter that do. Out here, the land is honest. If you are wrong about something, the land tells you immediately." Poe, who had been listening with his whole body the way he always listened, leaned forward and said, very quietly, "Like the water." "Exactly like the water," she agreed, and smiled at him, and Poe smiled back, a rare and remarkable thing that made Emmett's chest ache in the good way, the way it had ached when Poe was very small and would fall asleep against Emmett's shoulder, and he had to look away at the window again. After supper, Caleb followed Delia out to the porch. Emmett could hear them from the kitchen where he was putting away the dishes, hear the low murmur of Caleb's voice and Delia's, and after a moment he heard Caleb say something louder and with feeling, and then Delia's voice, steady and unhurried, and then silence, and then Caleb's voice again, and then nothing. He walked to the door and looked out. Caleb was sitting on the porch step with his elbows on his knees, and Delia was sitting in the wooden chair beside him, and Caleb was saying something in a low, private voice. Emmett stepped back from the door. He was not going to listen, but he stayed close. Caleb said, "He just never talks about her, not ever. And sometimes I think he's going to forget what she sounded like." There was a pause. Then Delia said, "Have you told him that?" "I can't." "Why not?" "Because he'll think I'm a pause, because I don't know how." Another pause. Then Delia said, "You could write it down. You are getting quite good at writing. You could write him a letter." Emmett pressed the flat of his hand against the kitchen wall and breathed. "A letter," Caleb said, "to my own father, in the same house." "Some things are easier to say on paper," Delia said. "There is no shame in using the tools that work." A long silence. "Maybe," Caleb said finally. Emmett walked away from the door before he heard more. He went to the barn and stood in the dark and listened to the horses breathing for a while, and he thought about Clara, and about the fact that he had not spoken her name aloud in 2 years, and about the possibility that his silence about her had been a protection he had mistaken for strength, and about the woman sitting on his porch helping his son find words he could not find for himself. He stayed in the barn until the lamp in the house went dark. The following Saturday, the town of Ridgecroft held its summer gathering in the main square, which was a monthly occurrence that combined the practical purposes of a livestock market, a supply exchange, and a social function. Emmett brought the boys in for supplies, and because Nate had entered a mathematics competition held by the schoolmaster and intended to win it, which he did, with a margin that made the schoolmaster rub his mustache and look uncomfortable. Delia came as well because Emmett had offered to drive her in, and she needed new chalk and 3 books she had ordered through the general store. They walked into town separately in the sense that Emmett went to the feed store and Delia went to the general store, but they ended up in the same orbit for most of the morning in the way that happens when 2 people are paying attention to the same set of children in an unfamiliar space. Emmett watched her handle the world of Ridgecroft with the same methodical competence she handled everything else. She was pleasant to the storekeeper and firm about the order she had placed and had not received correctly, correcting the discrepancy with a receipt she had kept, and a calm certainty that made the storekeeper recheck his ledger twice before conceding she was right. She bought her chalk and her books, and she found Poe at the confectionery looking longingly at the penny candy with his hands firmly behind his back, and she bought him a single piece and told him he could have it after supper, which was both generous and structured in a way that was so perfectly Delia that Emmett had to look at the feed display to compose himself. The trouble arrived around midday in the form of a man named Gerald Prout, who was a cattle buyer from out of the county, and a man Emmett had had 2 previous disputes with over land and water rights, none of which had been resolved to anyone's particular satisfaction. Prout was the kind of man who wore his money visibly and treated other people's dignity as a resource he was entitled to consume. He arrived in the square with 2 hands, both of them large, and he spotted Delia before Emmett did. Emmett saw the aftermath. He was coming out of the feed store with a 100-pound sack of oats over his shoulder when he heard Delia's voice, not raised, but with a specific quality to it that he was already learning to read, the quality that meant she was controlling something that wanted to be otherwise. He set down the sack and went to her. Prout was standing too close to her. He was a big man, not as big as Emmett but substantial, with the posture of someone who was accustomed to taking up more space than he occupied by right. He was saying something about what a fine-looking woman she was, and what a waste it was for a woman like her to be out here teaching ranch children when she might enjoy the comforts of Amarillo. And his tone had the particular slick confidence of a man who had never been told no in a way he actually heard. "I have told you twice," Delia was saying, with the precision of a blade, "that I am not interested in your observations about my appearance or your recommendations about my occupation. I would like you to step back now." "No need to get unfriendly," Prout said, with the smile of a man who thinks unfriendliness is a female problem. "I'm just making conversation." "You are not," she said. "You are occupying space I did not invite you into and persisting after I have asked you to stop. Those are two different things." Emmett arrived beside her and stood there. He did not say anything immediately. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall and broad across the chest, and he had been working cattle since he was 12 years old. And when he stood next to someone, there was generally a conversation between bodies that preceded any conversation between mouths. He felt Prout become aware of him, and then Prout looked at him, and the smile shifted into something that was trying to be casual and landing much closer to reassessment. "Conroy," Prout said. "Prout," Emmett said. A brief silence. "Didn't realize she was with you," Prout said. "She is not with me in the sense you mean," Emmett said. "She is her own person who does not require your commentary regardless of her association with anyone. I believe she asked you to step back." Prout stepped back. He looked between them with an expression that was calculating something, and then he nodded tightly and moved away, and Emmett turned to look at Delia, who was watching Prout's departing back with the expression she wore when she was making assessments. "Thank you," she said, without taking her eyes off Prout. "Though I had the matter in hand." "I know," he said. She looked at him then. Something surprised moved across her face, as though she had expected him to qualify the statement or take the credit for the resolution, and he had not, and she did not know what to do with that. Then she said, "He has been in dispute with you before." "More than once." "He is the kind of man who makes disputes into tools," she said thoughtfully. "Watch your eastern boundary with him. His kind always comes at things sideways." Emmett looked at her. "You got all of that from watching him for 2 minutes." "I got most of it from watching him for 30 seconds, she said. 2 minutes gave me the rest." She picked up the box of books she had set down and said, "Shall we find the boys? Nate will have won his competition by now, and will need someone to celebrate with before his head grows too large for his hat." He walked beside her across the square and thought about the eastern boundary, and about Gerald Prout's sideways methods, and about the fact that he had been on this land for 12 years, and had not articulated that specific concern in exactly those terms, and she had done it in 2 minutes. And he thought that Delia Langston was, in some ways, that he was only beginning to map. A great deal more than he had anticipated, and he was going to need significantly more time to understand the full dimensions of what that meant for him. Nate had indeed won the competition, and he described the winning calculation at supper with such exhaustive detail that Caleb fell asleep against the wall, and Poe, who had been trying very hard to understand the mathematics, finally said solemnly, "I liked the part where you said the number," which was so earnest and so perfectly Poe that Delia laughed again, that clear brief laugh, and this time Emmett was looking directly at her when it happened and saw the way her whole face changed when she laughed. The seriousness falling away for just a moment and something younger and brighter appearing underneath. And he stored that image without knowing he was doing it, the way the land stores water in deep places that take a long time to reach. August arrived with heat that pressed down on the panhandle like a hand. The creek dropped, as Delia had predicted, and Emmett shifted the cattle rotation based on her early recommendation, and it made a significant difference. The boys continued their lessons, 6 mornings a week, with the 7th left free for ranch work and rest. Caleb was reading full chapters of a history book Delia had brought and arguing the contents, with a confidence that was new and startling, and occasionally argumentative, in ways that required Emmett to do more thinking than he was necessarily prepared for at breakfast. Nate had started teaching himself basic astronomy from a book Delia had ordered from a catalog, and he had begun sleeping on the roof to look at the stars, which Emmett had objected to on safety grounds, and then built him a platform rail to sleep behind, which was a kind of defeat he was comfortable with. Poe was reading, not perfectly, not fluently, but reading, real sentences, not just words. He had worked through the entirety of Annabel Lee with Delia's help, and had started a second poem, The Raven, which was perhaps somewhat gothic for an 8-year-old, but which Emmett suspected Delia had allowed precisely because it was gothic. Because Poe responded to beauty with a seriousness and depth that required taking him seriously. And Delia always took him seriously. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. Emmett found it slipped under the door of his office when he came in from the early morning feed. It was on a piece of the heavy writing paper Delia stocked for the boys' exercises, and the handwriting was Caleb's, the new handwriting that did not reverse, careful and deliberate, and clearly composed over more than one sitting because the ink varied slightly in darkness. It was addressed to Dad. Emmett sat down at his desk and opened it. He did not record afterward exactly what it contained, because it was private in the way that the most important things are private. But it contained, in Caleb's struggling and becoming handwriting, things about Clara that Caleb remembered and was afraid his father was letting go of, and things about what it had been like to be 16 and trying to be the oldest and not knowing how to be whatever it was the oldest was supposed to be after his mother died. It contained the word afraid 4 times, which was 4 more times than Emmett had ever heard his eldest son say it. And at the end it said, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the rest, as though it had been written faster or with a shaking hand, that he thought Miss Langston was the first person since Mama who made the house feel like the kind of place people were supposed to live in, and he thought Dad ought to know that. Emmett sat with the letter for a long time. The sun moved through the window and marked its passage across his desk. He heard the boys going into the barn for their lessons, heard Delia's voice begin the morning session with a question, heard Nate answer immediately, heard Poe's careful, slower voice attempt a response and then succeed, heard Delia say something quiet and encouraging. He thought about the night he had driven into Ridgecroft in a freezing January and sent the letter to the bureau in Amarillo, desperate and proud in equal measure, not knowing what he was asking for or whether it would come. He thought about how the house had felt for 3 years. Not empty, because his sons were in it and his sons were loud and alive and full, but something absent from the structure of it. Some weight removed that everything else was quietly leaning toward the absence of. He folded the letter and put it in his inside pocket, close to his chest, and he sat for another minute, and then he went to the barn doorway and waited for a natural pause in the lesson. Delia was at the slate board, writing a problem, and she glanced at him sideways as he appeared and then back at the board, and he said, "Caleb, when you have a moment." Caleb looked up from his reading, and something in Emmett's face must have told him something, because the wariness in Caleb's face slowly became something more uncertain and more open. He came to the door. Emmett put a hand on the back of the boy's neck the way he had when Caleb was small, and he said very quietly, "Thank you for writing it down." Caleb went still. Then he said, rough-voiced, "Okay." "Your mother," Emmett said. He stopped. He tried again. "Your mother would be so proud of who you are becoming. I want you to know I think of her. I think of her every day. I just didn't know how to say it without—" He stopped again. "Without making it worse," Caleb said. "Yes. Me too," Caleb said. They stood for a moment, the two of them, father and son, in the barn door with the August sun slanting down, and it was not solved or healed, nothing like that, but something had been opened that had been sealed, and the air moved through it differently now, and that was enough, that was more than enough. After Caleb went back inside, Emmett stayed in the doorway for a moment. Delia was writing on the board again, her back to him. He watched her hand move across the slate with that familiar, precise motion, and he thought, "I need to say something to her." He went back to the fence work without saying anything. But the intention was there now, and intentions in motion have a momentum of their own. The crisis, when it came, arrived not from Gerald Prout's sideways methods or from drought or cattle loss or any of the frontier dangers that kept ranchers awake at night. It arrived from the direction Emmett least expected, which was his own heart. It was a September evening. The heat had broken at last, and the air had the clarity that comes to Texas in the early fall, that particular clean sharpness that makes everything visible to a far distance. Delia had finished the evening lesson and the boys were fed, and Caleb and Nate were in their room arguing about the Roman Empire, which was a current focus of Nate's, and Poe had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire with his poetry book open on his chest, which was where he generally ended every evening that had gone well. Emmett found Delia on the porch. She had her notebook, but she was not writing. She was looking out at the land in the early dark, her hands folded on top of the notebook, and the lamp beside her cast a warm and specific light across the line of her jaw and the curve of her shoulder and the careful braided dark of her hair. And Emmett Conroy stood in the doorway and looked at her and knew, with the kind of certainty that comes not from thought but from something deeper than thought, that he was in love with her. Not becoming, not approaching, in love. Past the boundary, past the point where turning back makes any real sense, in love. He had been avoiding it for 2 months. He had been constructing reasons why this was impractical and inappropriate, and why she was here in a professional capacity, and why 3 sons and a ranch and a history were a great deal to ask anyone to enter, and why she had not given him any indication, and why he was not the kind of man who was easy to know. He had been very thorough about all of these reasons. None of them had worked. He sat down in the other chair on the porch. She glanced at him and then back at the horizon. "The boys did well today," she said. "They always do," he said. "Because of you." A brief pause. "Because of themselves," she said. "I only provide the conditions." "Delia," he said. She looked at him. The full attention of her, the way she gave her full attention to everything, and it was a considerable thing to receive. He did not look away from it. "I need to say something," he said, "and I am aware it may change the terms of your contract and the arrangement we have. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will respect it, and nothing between you and the boys will change. They need you here, and that need is separate from what I am going to say." She had gone very still, the kind of stillness that was not absence but intensified presence. "I am not good at this," he said. "I was not particularly good at it the first time, and Clara was patient with me about it, and I don't expect the same patience from anyone. But I have been watching you for 2 months. I have been watching you with my sons and with my land and with the world in general, and I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered, and I think—" He stopped. He said, more carefully, "I would like to spend more time with you that is not structured around the ranch or the lessons. If that is something you would be willing to consider." The silence that followed was long enough that he began to prepare himself for what came next, for the polite and sensible refusal, for the maintenance of professional terms, for the managed distance he would have to keep for the rest of her contracted year, and the management of his own heart around it, which was going to be considerable work. Then Delia said, "I have been here for 2 months, and in that time you have listened to me when I spoke about things that men, in my experience generally, do not take seriously from women. You have thanked me when I did useful things without making it surprising that I was capable of them. When Prout spoke to me in the square, you stood beside me and not in front of me." She paused. "Do you understand what I am saying?" "I think so," he said. "I came here for the teaching," she said. "I was not planning for anything else. I have been in general very good at not planning for anything else." But she stopped. She looked down at the notebook in her hands, which she was holding more tightly than she needed to. "I have been thinking about this as well," she said, "for some weeks. I want you to know that." Something moved through Emmett's chest that was so large and sudden it was almost uncomfortable. He said, "Then I would like to start with supper, not here at the house, in town. Next Saturday, if you are willing." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "Yes." It was, all things considered, not the most elaborate or poetic exchange of such intentions in the history of the frontier, but it was entirely honest, and honesty was the language they both spoke most fluently, and so it meant more than poetry would have. He took her to supper at the hotel in Ridgecroft the following Saturday. She wore the gray dress she had arrived in because it was the best one she had, and he wore his good jacket and the clean hat, and they sat at a table by the window and talked for 2 hours about everything except the ranch and the boys. which revealed quickly that they had no shortage of things to say to each other when the practical matters were removed. She told him about New Mexico territory and her father, and the years of moving across the land with a surveying kit and a library of natural science books. He told her about arriving in the Texas Panhandle at 22 with nothing except a determination to build something, and about the years of building it, and about what it had looked like when it was done. She asked questions about things he said that other people did not generally ask, which told him that she was genuinely interested, not performing interest, and it made him talk more freely than he was accustomed to. When they were walking back to the wagon, she said, "I want to be honest with you about something." "All right," he said. "My contract is for 1 year," she said. "I have been considering the extension you mentioned in your original letter. But I want to be clear that if I extend, it is because the boys still need teaching and because I believe in finishing what I start, not because of this." She gestured between them. "I do not want you to ever think that my choices about my work are influenced by my personal feelings or to feel any pressure about what might come of this." He stopped walking. He turned to look at her in the street. "Delia," he said, "you are the only person who has ever felt the need to say that to me, and I want you to know I consider it the most respectable thing anyone has said to me in years." She looked slightly startled, as though she had been braced for a different response. Then something softened around her eyes. "I am also not entirely sure what I am doing," she said in a quieter voice. "Neither am I," he said. She nodded. "Then we are starting from an equal position." "Seems right," he said. They drove back to the ranch under a sky full of stars and did not say much, but the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need filling. Over the following weeks they had supper in town twice more, and on the third occasion she met him at the east pasture in the early evening, with the small telescope Nate had been using, and they watched a meteor shower that Delia had read would be visible that week, lying side by side in the grass with the vast Texas sky spread above them. And at some point in the course of watching stars fall, he had taken her hand and she had let him, and neither of them had remarked on it. Because to remark on it would have been to make it less than what it was. The boys noticed everything. Boys always do. Caleb said nothing, but he stopped avoiding Delia's eye when she came through in the evenings, which was its own kind of permission. Nate said at breakfast one morning, with his characteristic directness, "Are you and Miss Langston going to get married?" And Emmett said, "That is not your business, Nate." And Nate said, "It is our business because we live here," which was, objectively, a fair point. And Emmett said, "We will discuss it at an appropriate time," which was his way of not answering. And Nate recorded this in the notebook he used for tracking data he considered significant, which Emmett discovered later and thought was both alarming and purely Nate. Poe said nothing about any of it, but one morning he left a drawing on Delia's teaching table before the lesson, which he had worked on secretly the previous evening. It was a house, recognizable as the Conroy Ranch house, with stick figures of varying heights in front of it, and the tallest figure had a hat, and the figure beside it had a long braid, and they were holding hands. Delia kept it in the front of her notebook for the rest of the year. Gerald Prout made his move in October, which was when Delia had said to watch the eastern boundary, and she was right. He filed a claim with the county that disputed 15 acres of Emmett's eastern pasture, citing an alleged discrepancy in the original survey. It was the kind of legal maneuvering that took time and money to fight, and was designed to wear a smaller rancher down through the process rather than the merits. And Emmett came home from town with the notice and the grim expression of a man who knows he is in for a fight. Delia asked him about it at supper when the boys had gone to their room. He told her. He told her about the original survey, about the claim, about Prout's history of exactly this kind of action with other ranchers in the county, 3 of whom had eventually sold parcels rather than fight the paperwork. She was quiet for a moment. Then she went to her room and came back with a folder, a real folder with papers in it. She opened it on the table. She had the corrected survey she had done herself in August. She had mapped it with her father's instruments, documented it in the format she had learned from his official surveying work, and she had the measurements triangulated from 3 fixed points on the property, including the creek bend that she had identified early on as a reliable natural marker. The documentation was clean and precise and cross-referenced, and it identified the eastern boundary with specificity that would be difficult to argue against. Emmett looked at it for a long time. "You did this in August," he said. "Yes," she said, "before any of this started." "Yes," she paused. "I told you he seemed like the kind of man who came at things sideways. I was not sure exactly what form it would take, but I thought it worth being prepared." He looked up at her. She was watching him with the careful attention she always gave to significant moments, waiting to see what he did with the information rather than telling him what to do with it. "This is going to be enough to stop the claim," he said. "I believe so. You will want a lawyer to review it and submit it formally, but yes, the survey documentation is accurate and can be verified." He sat back. He looked at the papers and then at her. "Delia," he said. "I know," she said. "The timing is convenient." "The timing is extraordinary," he said. "You walked my property in August at 5 in the morning because you thought I might need this someday." "I walked your property because I needed the morning air and I had the instruments," she said, with a small curve at the corner of her mouth. The usefulness was secondary. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn after the snake incident, that moment of being profoundly, genuinely impressed in a way that had no performance in it, the pure response to witnessing something excellent. "You are remarkable," he said. The curve at her mouth became something fuller and less controlled. "You have said that before. I expect I will say it many more times," he said. He filed the survey documentation with the county attorney the following week. The attorney reviewed it, verified the methodology against the accepted standards, and submitted a formal counterclaim response on Emmett's behalf. Pruitt's claim was reviewed and found insufficient in light of the documented evidence. The 15 acres remained Conroy land, and Pruitt, faced with an opponent who had actual documentation, retreated and found someone else to press. Emmett brought Delia a book from the town's small selection of new arrivals to mark the resolution of the dispute, which was a collection of natural science essays she had mentioned wanting. She looked at it for a moment and then at him and said, "This is thoughtful," in the way she said things that meant more than the words conveyed. He said, "It is insufficient," and she said, "It is not," and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the kitchen with the panhandle wind moving outside and the house quiet around them, and he kissed her. It was not uncertain. It was not tentative. It had too many months of careful and accumulating awareness behind it to be anything other than what it was, which was two people being honest with each other in a physical language, and it was one of the most genuine things Emmett Conroy had felt since he did not know when. She kissed him back. And that was that. October gave way to November, and November brought the cold in earnest, and the schoolroom in the barn required a small stove, which Emmett installed without being asked, and the boys' lessons continued to progress and to deepen. Caleb had finished the history book and started a second one, and had developed a specific and passionate interest in the wars of the previous century, and had begun, of his own free will, to keep a daily journal, which he did not share with anyone but which he carried with him everywhere. Nate had passed a mathematics examination from a correspondence school in Dallas that Delia had arranged for him, intended for students 4 years his senior, and had passed with a mark that made the correspondent write back to ask whether the student was truly 10 years old. Poe was reading continuously, anything he could get his hands on, with a hunger that was almost fierce, as though all the words he had been unable to reach were now arriving at once, and he needed to receive all of them. In December, near Christmas, there was a gathering at the Ridgecroft Community Hall to which most of the ranching families in the area came, and Emmett brought the boys and Delia came as his guest, and Ridgecroft being a small community in which nothing was private, everyone knew what that meant, and there were looks exchanged and opinions formed, some of them benign and some of them less so. Because a woman who wore a pistol and surveyed property and kept her own counsel was not everyone's idea of a suitable arrangement for a widower with 3 children. The pastor's wife, a woman named Mrs. Hollister, who was kind at heart but had a strong investment in social order, said to Delia at the punch bowl, "It is admirable what you have done for those boys, though I imagine you will be looking to move on once the year is up. Women in your position generally do." Delia said pleasantly, "I imagine you are right about many women in many positions. I cannot speak for any arrangement but my own." Then she carried 2 cups of punch back to where Emmett was standing and handed him one and said, quietly, "I would like you to know that I am not planning to move on." He took the cup. "Good," he said, "because I was going to ask you not to." She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes over the rim of the cup. "In a more formal sense," he said, "when the time seemed right." "The time," she said carefully, "seems more right than it is going to get." He looked around the community hall. His boys were all present. Caleb was talking to another young man about something, using his hands for emphasis. Nate was explaining something to the schoolmaster, who looked both impressed and vaguely threatened. Poe was sitting in a corner reading a book he had brought in his coat pocket. He thought about the letter Caleb had written. He thought about Poe's drawing on the teaching table, the stick figures holding hands in front of the house. He thought about the stars falling over the east pasture and her hand in his. He turned back to Delia. "Delia Langston," he said, "I have nothing poetic to offer you. I have a ranch and 3 sons and a considerable amount of work and a history that is sometimes heavy and a heart that has been closed for too long. You have had more life in this place in 5 months than I managed in 3 years. I do not want to spend the next 30 years wondering what would have happened if I had asked you properly." She had set down her cup. "Are you asking me properly?" she said. "I am asking if you will marry me," he said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked her cup back up and said, "I have 3 conditions." He almost smiled. "Of course you do. The first condition is that I continue teaching," she said. "Not just your sons, but others in the area who need it. There are children in this county with no access to proper education, and I intend to remedy that as much as is possible." "Agreed," he said. "The second condition is that if I see something on the land or about the ranch that requires attention, you will listen to me the way you have been listening to me." "Agreed," he said, "and I would point out that I already have been." "I know," she said. "I am formalizing it." "What is the third condition?" he asked. She looked at him with the expression that was almost a smile but not quite, the one that meant she was working very hard at something. "Tell me what you said to Caleb in the barn," she said. "He did not tell me because it was private, but whatever you said to him, you should say those things more often. He needs to hear them from you." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That one is not a condition. That one is a request." "Yes," she agreed. "I will do my best," he said. "That is all anyone can do," she said. "Yes. Yes to the conditions." "Yes to the question," she said. And this time the smile arrived fully, and it was the clear and bright and unguarded one, the rare one. And standing in the Ridgecroft Community Hall in December of 1882, with the fiddle playing somewhere behind him and his 3 sons scattered around the room like anchors he was moored to, Emmett Conroy felt something come fully and finally open in his chest. And it was, without question or complication, the best thing he had felt in years. They were married in March of 1883, at the ranch, with the early spring light coming low and golden across the panhandle, and the cottonwood trees beginning to show their first green. It was a practical ceremony performed by the pastor, brief and unadorned in the way both of them preferred, with the boys as witnesses. Caleb stood straight and formal and could not quite keep the emotion off his face in the final moments, and did not seem to mind that he couldn't. Nate had prepared a short reading from a historical document about the rights and responsibilities of matrimony that he had found in a reference book, which he delivered with great seriousness, and which the pastor took in stride with the adaptability of a man long accustomed to frontier congregations. Poe read a single verse from Annabel Lee, because it had been chosen as a love poem, and he read it perfectly, without a single stumble. And the look on Delia's face in that moment was something that would be described in Caleb's journal later that evening as the face of someone who has accomplished something important and is not going to make a fuss about it, but is going to keep it. After the ceremony, when the small gathering of neighboring families had eaten the meal and begun to drift home in the late afternoon, Emmett found Delia standing at the fence of the east pasture, looking out across the land. He came and stood beside her. "Second thoughts?" he asked. "None," she said. "I was noting that the grass in the northwest section has come back well from the winter rotation. The method is working." He looked at the grass. It was indeed coming back well. "Miss Langston," he said, which made her look at him with an eyebrow raised. "My apologies, Mrs. Conroy." Something moved through her face that was entirely new, something unguarded and perhaps slightly overwhelmed, quickly controlled but not before he saw it. "That will require some adjustment," she said quietly. "Take as long as you need," he said, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him by a fraction, and they looked out across the spring pasture together, and the land was wide and the sky was wider, and the house behind them held 3 boys who were reading and arguing and studying stars, and everything that had been missing from the weight of the structure had returned. The year that followed was the fullest year Emmett Conroy had known in a long time. Delia expanded her teaching to include the children of 2 neighboring families who had no access to formal schooling, riding out 3 mornings a week to hold lessons at the Gallagher Ranch 6 miles south, which brought her teaching practice to 7 children total beside the boys, and she documented each one's progress with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. She corresponded with the normal school in Missouri about establishing a more formal school in the county, and began the long work of petitioning the county board for a school building and funding, which was slow and bureaucratic, and required a patience she kept intact through sheer determination. Emmett expanded the cattle operation modestly using the land and water planning Delia had contributed to, and the summer of 1883 was productive enough that they had a surplus they had not seen since the early years of the ranch. He told her this. She said, "Tell Caleb and Nate and Poe. Their participation in the morning feed rotation freed up 2 of your hours every day that you applied to the cattle work directly. The surplus is partly theirs," he told them at supper. Caleb straightened with a kind of pride that was not arrogance but was solid and real. Nate immediately began calculating the percentage contribution per labor hour invested, which Delia encouraged and Emmett accepted as Nate being Nate. Poe looked around the table at all of them and said, in his quiet and certain way, "We are a good family," which was both the simplest and the most exact assessment of the situation, and settled over the table like the best kind of silence. In the autumn of 1883, Delia told Emmett she was expecting a child. She told him in her direct way in the kitchen where she had been reviewing her teaching notes and he had been making coffee, and she simply said, "I want you to know that I am expecting," and he turned around from the stove and looked at her with the coffee pot still in his hand. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. "It is early, I believe April." He set the coffee pot down. He crossed the kitchen and he took her face in both his hands very carefully, the way you hold something that matters more than caution, and he said, "Delia," and she said, "I know," and he kissed her forehead and held her there for a moment, and she let him, which was its own kind of statement from a woman who was not generally given to being held for long without commenting on it. She continued teaching through the winter. She reduced the long rides to the Gallagher Ranch in the colder months, and arranged for the Gallagher children to come to the Double-C instead, which the Gallagher family agreed to, because they had seen what the education was doing for their children, and the arrangement was worth the inconvenience. The schoolroom in the barn grew accordingly, and the single slate board became 2, and Delia reorganized the learning wall to accommodate the larger group. Caleb, at 17, had become something of an assistant in the classroom, working with the youngest Gallagher children on their letters in the mornings before his own more advanced lessons. He did this without being asked. He did this because he remembered, though he would not have said so aloud, what it had felt like to be unable to do the thing that was expected of him, and he did not want anyone to feel that way if he could help it. Delia noticed. She added formal teaching methodology to his lessons and told him, straightforwardly, that if he wanted it, there was a career in education that she thought would suit him. Caleb received this information and said nothing, but he started reading her pedagogy books in the evenings. The child arrived in late April of 1884, 3 days before the expected date, which was inconvenient in the way that children are always inconvenient about timing. He was a boy, arrived in the early morning with the help of the neighboring rancher's wife who had experience in such matters, and he was healthy and loud, which the whole house heard, and which brought 3 older brothers to various positions of nervous hovering outside the bedroom door. Emmett sat on the edge of the bed and held the baby and looked at Delia, who was tired in a way that was satisfied rather than depleted, and she looked back at him with those storm-gray eyes, and he said, "What would you like to name him?" She said, "I have been thinking about Ezra." He tried it. "Ezra Conroy," she nodded. "Ezra," he said to the baby. The baby scrunched his face in a way that suggested he was reserving judgment on the name and everything else, until he had gathered more information, which was, Emmett thought, a perfectly Delia response from a very small person who was already demonstrating a family resemblance. He brought the boys in, one by one. Caleb held the baby with the careful concentration of someone who knows they are doing something important and does not want to get it wrong. Nate observed the baby with his empirical attention and said, "His head is an unusual shape, but I understand that is temporary," which made Delia, exhausted as she was, exhale with something close to laughter. Poe sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Ezra for a long time without speaking, and then he said, to no one in particular, "I am going to read to him." "Yes," Delia said. "You are." The school that Delia had been petitioning for was approved by the county in the summer of 1884, and the building was raised by the community in the fall, which was how such things were done on the frontier. The school was a single large room with 8 windows and 2 doors, built at the center of the community, where the distance was reasonable for most of the ranching families. Delia was appointed its first teacher by the county board, which was only logical since she had been the one to organize the entire effort. She rode out to teach 6 mornings a week and was home by early afternoon, and Emmett arranged the ranch schedule around her school schedule because it made sense, and because the school was as important as the cattle, and that was a fact he had arrived at honestly. On the day the school opened, 14 children arrived, which was more than the county board had projected and which Delia had projected exactly. The schoolroom held all of them with room for expansion. Nate, who was now 11, attended as a student in the advanced subjects and an informal assistant in the mathematics. Poe, who was 9, sat in the front row and opened his book with the expression of someone arriving at a place they have been trying to reach for a very long time. Caleb did not attend the school. He was 17 and past that stage. But he was there for the opening, standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was trying not to show that something mattered to him. And at the end of the day, when Delia was locking the door, he said, "It is a good school," and she said, "Yes, it is. We are going to need more teachers eventually. I hope you will think about that." And he said, "I have been thinking about it." And that was the last they said of it in that conversation, but it was the beginning of something that would take shape in its own time. That evening, by some informal agreement, they all gathered on the porch as the sun went down. Emmett and Delia in the 2 chairs, Ezra in Delia's arms, the boys arranged on the steps and the rail in the various configurations of adolescent casualness. The light was enormous across the panhandle, the way it got in the fall, and the land went out and out in every direction under it. Poe said from the second step, "Can I read something?" "Yes," Delia said. He opened his book. He read from Annabel Lee, the whole poem beginning to end, without pausing except for the breath the poem required, his voice clear and steady and true, and the words moved out across the porch and the yard and the land in the failing light, and no one said anything while he read, and when he finished there was the kind of silence that follows something that has been done well, the silence of things received. "Thank you, Poe," Delia said. "You taught me," Poe said. "You learned," she said. "Those are not the same thing." Emmett reached across and took her hand where it rested beside Ezra, and she turned her palm up and held his hand, and the evening came on full and soft, and the stars began to appear one by one, and Nate said from the rail, "There is Jupiter," and pointed at a bright steady light low in the south, and everyone looked where he was pointing, and the sky was very large above them. In the years that followed, the Double C grew steadily and responsibly under the joint attention of two people who were both practical and who trusted each other's judgment. The county school gained 3 more students every year for 5 years, and then Delia successfully applied for a second teacher to be funded by the county, and the person she recommended for the position was Caleb Conroy, 18 years old by then, and formally trained by correspondence with the normal school in Missouri, who became the youngest schoolteacher in the county, and proved, after an initial period of terrifying the students slightly with his height and intensity, to be genuinely excellent at the work. Nate went to university in Austin on a mathematics scholarship at 16, which made the household simultaneously proud and somewhat quieter, and he wrote letters every week that were so dense with information that Delia read them aloud at dinner in installments. He came home every summer and reorganized something on the ranch to be more efficient, which Emmett accepted with less resistance than he might have imagined, because the efficiency generally worked. Poe grew into a serious and precise and occasionally luminous young man who read everything he could find and who eventually began to write, not poetry but something adjacent to it, clear and observant writing about the land and the people who lived on it, which a newspaper in Amarillo began publishing when he was 17, which surprised him and did not surprise Delia in the slightest. Delia and Emmett had 2 more children after Ezra. A daughter named Marin who arrived in 1886, and then another son, Silas, in 1888. Marin was, from the first moment she was old enough to have opinions about it, interested in everything Delia did, following her to school and watching the lessons with concentrated attention, and insisting at age 4 on being given her own piece of chalk. Silas was, from the first moment he was old enough to have opinions about it, interested in the horses, specifically, and the cattle more generally, and he would be found sleeping in the barn from the time he could walk well enough to get there on his own. The survey instruments that had saved the eastern boundary in 1882 hung on the wall of the house office in a frame that Emmett built for them, because Delia had mentioned once that they had belonged to her father and that she kept them for that reason, and it seemed to him that they deserved to be somewhere visible rather than packed in a satchel. She had not said anything when she first saw them on the wall. She had stood and looked at them for a moment, and then she had turned and looked at him, and the thing in her face was not demonstrative or excessive. It was quiet and real, and she said, "Thank you," in the same voice she used for the things that mattered most. The letter from the bureau in Amarillo had said, in its bureaucratic way, that one educator was available for assignment for a 1-year contracted term. What arrived was a woman who could track and survey and shoot and argue and listen, and read the land and read people and teach, with a combination of rigor and compassion that changed the trajectory of every student she ever had. What arrived was someone whose intelligence was of the active, observing, connecting kind that did not wait to be asked for its usefulness, but identified what was needed and moved toward it. What arrived was someone who had her own history and her own losses and her own independence, and who chose, with full information and her characteristic precision, to make her life part of his life and his son's lives and his land's life, not because she needed any of it but because she saw the value in it clearly, and she was always very good at recognizing the value in things. Emmett did not think of Delia as someone who completed something in him, because that framing suggested he had been incomplete, and he had not been incomplete. He had been fully present and functional in his grief and his work and his fatherhood. But he thought of her as someone who had opened a room in him he had not known was there, and that the room turned out to be the kind of room everything else wanted to gather in, and that having the room open made the rest of the house make more sense, and that was as close as he could come to describing it, and it was enough. On a spring evening in 1890, 8 years after Delia had stepped off the stage from Amarillo with a heavy satchel and a practical braid, and a pistol on her hip, Emmett sat on the porch of the Double C Ranch house with his wife beside him and Ezra and Marin and Silas, distributed around the yard in the particular chaos of a good evening in a full life. Inside the house, on the study shelf, Poe's most recent newspaper column was pressed between the covers of a book of poems. Caleb's school in Ridgecroft had been recognized by the county for its outcomes. Nate's most recent letter from Austin said he had been offered a position with the university's mathematics department. The eastern boundary was secure. The grass in the northwest section continued to flourish. Delia was reading, the way she was always doing something purposeful, her notebook balanced on her knee, and Emmett was watching the land go dark in the west in the way he had watched it go dark almost every evening since he built this house. But it looked different now than it had looked for the 3 years after Clara died, and that difference was not the absence of grief, because grief does not leave, but the presence of something alongside it that was living and warm and full of intention. He said her name. She looked up. He said, "I want you to know that I think this is the best thing I have ever built." She looked at the yard, at the children, at the house behind them, at the land ahead. Then she looked at him. "We built it," she said. He said, "Yes." He paused. "You are going to correct everything I say for the rest of my life." "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "Good," he said. She returned to her notebook. He returned to watching the land. The stars came out, one by one, and Silas pointed at a horse in the paddock and named it something completely incorrect. And Marin corrected him with such authority that Emmett felt a very specific recognition. And Ezra, 8 years old and his mother's son in the way he moved through the world, sat down in the yard and opened a book and began to read in the last available light, and the evening came on warm and full and entirely as it should be, and the Double C was at peace, and all of them were there. And it was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything.